I would introduce and welcome our panelists here. We are having a one-on-one conversation between Francois Gaudement, Senior Advisor for Asia at the Institute Mongenyang. I don't believe I said that correctly, sir, thank you. As well as a good friend and colleague here from PISM, Justyna Szudzlik, Deputy Head of Research at the Polish Institute of International Affairs, and dare I say, a very accomplished expert on Chinese politics. Justyna, take it away.
Thanks, Peter. Good afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my enormous pleasure to welcome all of you to our conversation, the short 30-minute panel with Francois Gaudement from Institute Montaigne, one of the best experts on China across the globe, so there is no need to introduce Francois. Francois, I'm extremely happy that you've accepted our invitation. And we will be talking about China. China has been already mentioned in the previous panels, and it is time to focus more on this country and to think if China is a challenge or maybe a threat for us. After the 3 sessions devoted to finding ways how to win war with Russia and focusing on Russia as our biggest imminent threat, not only challenge but a threat, debating the role of the United States in Europe and defining who we are as the collective West, it is high time also to look farther eastward to China, because Russia is not the only challenge for us. And under Xi Jinping, China is becoming more authoritarian and in a very explicit way cooperates with Russia, before Russia's assault on Ukraine and after. We can see that there is a kind of China's political endorsement of Russia's assault of Ukraine. China is emulating or mirroring Russia's propaganda and disinformation, accusing NATO for such a situation, for Russia's aggression. Also, we can see what China is doing here in Europe, deploying punitive measures against Lithuania and multinational companies. So to some extent, in my perception, that we can say about China-Russia hand-in-hand attempt to undermine the economic security normative order in Europe and beyond. And of course, it is crucial year for China because of the Congress, and of course, important and difficult year, I think. And this was the case even before the Russia's aggression against Ukraine. I'm talking about the fact that Xi Jinping is trying to secure and extend its leadership to the 3rd term, and of course there are many social and economic domestic problems in China. So I think that we should start to talk at the very beginning, and I would ask Francois about China, and the state of China and the state of Xi Jinping. Let's get started from the, let's say, domestic situation and what China is doing, and then we could discuss some kind of China's foreign policy, how this, what is the impact of the, let's say, Russia's aggression of Ukraine on China's foreign policy. But let's get started to talk about, generally speaking, state of China and state of Xi Jinping. Francois, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Justyna, and it's the time to say that you write very interesting stuff at PISM, and your tweets are very interesting as well, including on Chinese sources. We got a head start on what I would call groping the elephant over some previous sessions, and our stage master just found that skin to be rather prickly, as I understand. China is ruled by Xi Jinping, no longer by a collective leadership. In some ways, it's more easy to describe what a personal ruler wants or does. The situation in Russia has simplified almost to that level in terms of decision-making. And even though we are undergoing now a little of an ambiguous phase before the Party Congress in the fall, in the main, the last decade has been Xi Jinping, so we can rely on what he says. Well, not completely. He's a liar, as Putin is, and he has lied repeatedly internationally, most famously to President Obama when he pledged not to militarize the South China Sea. That was probably one of the most obvious distortions of China's intentions. But nonetheless, as the quotation by our stage master showed, he's rather frank in a lot of what he says. And so we should read him. I've published, by the way, a little red book with quotes from Xi Jinping gathered over time, which at times are very revealing. Now, what is the agenda for China? What is the general line, as the Soviets would have said? I think for Xi Jinping, it's made of two elements: ending the NEP, again, a Russian word, the compromise as it had been built over decades and was thought by optimists to be eternal with capitalism and foreign investors. The deal that is slowly revealing itself is very different, perhaps helped by circumstances. COVID has been a big help, paradoxically, to help Xi Jinping achieve what he calls the priority to internal circulation over external circulation, and to reorder some priorities. And second, and his speeches and probably his mind are filled with it, it's about struggle. Struggle is clearly a word from the Cultural Revolution, and you cannot fail but go back to Xi Jinping as a teenager from a very privileged political family, having probably to disavow that family and to walk himself through those years of struggle, probably to lie a lot as well, in order to get back into the good graces of the party and to rise through the ranks and reveal himself, which he did in 2011, 2012. That's a major learning school. He has applied it internationally as well. It's something that is familiar to those who study Russia as well. It is the school of force, indeed, international relations. But Xi Jinping is not only that. He's also a pragmatist. He's somebody who leaves a lot of room for micromanagement as opposed to big issues. Let's never forget, he ruled, for example, Zhejiang, a province where grassroots capitalism dominates and which had literally 15% growth rates per year when he was at the top of it. He was used to wooing foreign investors in Shanghai, so he can alternate, he can cajole, and he can make big decisions. He's a guy who has started clearly a personality cult around him, but he's also able at very critical junctures to suddenly rediscover collective leadership. I've been struck by two episodes, one in February 2020, early February 2020, when COVID was taking hold and there'd been these big mistakes in addressing the issue in the first 2 months in China. And suddenly we got a video picture of the Politburo debating, speaking, talking about what to do about COVID. They had rediscovered collective leadership, which meant the responsibility would be shared. Today, we have a bit of an economic emergency in China, again, due to COVID and zero COVID policy. First, probably the biggest downturn since early 2020, and perhaps even more significant, in fact, because the lockdowns are not going to disappear overnight. And suddenly, when we look at the press, we see other leaders expressing themselves on the economy. Li Keqiang gets more, the prime minister gets a little more press. People who comment that tend to mistake this with struggle and two factions inside the party. My take on this is that Xi Jinping knows how to claim credit and also knows how to leave debit, so to speak, to others when the risks become too high. And that is a tactic. I would not attempt, as the title for this session suggested, to predict, what's the horse jockeying is going to be for the party congress, because I think by now, talking about factions, say that Li Keqiang wrote a PhD on law 20 years ago, or 30 years ago, or that Wang Yang used to be fairly soft in running Guangdong in some aspect. Well, is Medvedev today what he was 15 years ago, after 15 years of personal rule by Putin? And so it becomes very difficult to assert what individual positions are within the party. The second thing I want to say, if you give me 1 or 2 more minutes before getting to Russia and Ukraine, is that we've hyped so much the rise of China and its phenomenal growth that we may not be completely aware that perhaps we're now witnessing the heyday of this era, and not necessarily just a midpoint in that climb. There are several factors that come in here. One is demography. It's a very simple one, but it is true that the demographic fall of China is steeper than anything we've done that we've seen in East Asia, or even in Eastern Europe, by the way, after '89. And it's a big factor. Economists have overplayed this in the past because economists want quick consequences and discard politics. So for a long time, for example, the struggle against poverty in China actually helped to transfer more manpower to factories and delayed the moment when labor becomes scarce. But this is something that is happening. The second aspect is clearly diminishing results on capital and productivity. It's not a one-year event, it's a 10 years by 10 years curve. It's logical also because China just entered the club of rich countries, $12,000 per capita income. That doesn't mean that households actually get that income. The distribution is not exactly what it is in social democracies, shall we say. But it is becoming more difficult. And I would add that technological restrictions from the West, self-restrictions imposed by Xi Jinping on education in the West and communication and information are probably not going to help get to what is otherwise his paramount goal, go upscale and upscale forever in technology. This is something that is striking. So I'm a little less, shall we say, of a prophet of China's never stopping rise than some others. Do you want me to start on the Russia or Ukraine, or do you want to just take over?
Just if I may, because
you
said about this collective leadership that may reappear if there will be more problems domestically. And you also said that Xi Jinping is a person who knows how to make decisions. And I would like to ask you two questions in one question. The first is connected with the international situation and Russia's assault on Ukraine. So how much do external events impact Xi Jinping's policy, let's say domestically and in when it comes to foreign policy? And the second question in the one question, what lessons China has been learning or is learning from the war, from Russia's assault of Ukraine? Your assessment, I know it's difficult to look at this Xi Jinping's head, but, and of course maybe we think that China is watching and maybe is afraid of the fact that West is united. So what's your assessment? What kind of lessons China could be learning right now, looking at what's going on with Russia and with the united West?
Thanks. On the first question, when 2022 was starting, Xi Jinping was all about stability, predictability, no surprises, because this was, I mean, if I joke, it was his electoral year. He's going into the Congress and asking essentially for a life tenure under the name of a 5-year extension. And of course, that has been frustrated by events, or two events. One is Ukraine and the other one is COVID. I think of the two, COVID has a far bigger impact than Ukraine, even if Ukraine matters in terms of reputation internationally, even if that might at some point undermine some of the propaganda that is directed by the CCP to its own population. But truly, the direct impact of Russia and European affairs on China is minimal compared to what's happening with COVID. And this is something we have to get accustomed to repeatedly, that whatever their external designs, Chinese leaders spend much more time on their internal issues and problems, grappling with them without elections, I might add, without being distracted by elections. That's one aspect, of course, which in some aspects, in some respects, favor them. On the second question was what consequences to draw from the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Hey, that's a difficult one because, as we heard early this morning, the jury is still out on some aspects of the issue. But let's say my hunches. My hunch is that no, Putin didn't tell Xi exactly what he was going to do. Xi is not an idiot, even if he didn't believe American intelligence. Few people believed it, by the way, at the time because of the track record on Iraq of 2 decades ago. He must have felt that something but afoot, but something as big and the failure or the semi-failure that has resulted, very difficult. Hence the communique with a lot of verbal concessions by Putin, with a sweetheart deal for gas at reputedly very low prices already, so that in a way Xi Jinping once more got what he wanted in terms of energy from Russia, and didn't give that much except the notion of indivisible security, which is also a long-standing Chinese claim. Now, the euphoria in China among commentators lasted 48 hours and not more. And what we've seen this is a kind of division of role. Public propaganda relays almost all Russian claims, all the way to Nazi Europe and to biochemical labs and to, in fact, this is how COVID got into China, and so on, for whoever wants to believe it. The opinion of experts behind this, what we begin to hear quite openly, is that the decline of Russia is actually speeding up, is accelerating because of Putin's initiative. And we get a completely different tune. For example, the February 4 communique is not very often mentioned. That doesn't mean that China is not taking a protective stand for Russia, especially at the UN. They showed it again at the Human Rights Council a few days ago, but this coincides with their overall position on human rights. And I think we've entered in China now the era of what I would call plausible denial. If things keep going downhill for Russia, we'll find that China will draw out from past declarations stuff to show that it was more equidistant than we thought. The key event for me has been the publication in Chinese of a long interview of Ukraine's foreign minister, Mr. Kuleba, full of criticism of Russia and accessible to the Chinese public. In essence, a kind of warning that things are not completely what they seem. Then there is the caution on sanctions. Some things, it has already been addressed and we may come back to it. On the military side, it's guesswork for me, and I'm not a military expert, but obviously the talk about Ukraine is a very good example of how we should proceed with Taiwan, is no longer to be seen very widely. And I would think that the Chinese have begun to stop and pause and reflect that asymmetric warfare is not only something that they have in the past said they would practice, but that others can practice successfully. The one part where I'm not an optimist at all is the part about nuclear deterrence, because everything that has been said this morning, for example, shows that nuclear deterrence is effective, but is also very effective on the part of Russia. And this is a further argument for speeding up the goals of Russia now being realized partly in Western China to achieve, I wouldn't call it parity with the US, but a really credible nuclear deterrence. Taiwan, therefore, to me, and I'm hazarding this guess, is not so much an immediate consequence, is maybe even put on the back burner in military terms, but does not disappear at all. But the Chinese must realize that it's much harder than even they thought in the past.
Thanks, Francois. I have many questions, but I would like to ask the one question, and please think about your question, because I would like to pick one or two questions from the audience. Francois, you said about this Xi Jinping as a pragmatic leader, but also about some domestic problems that China is facing. And to be frank, here in Europe, we are talking about this China-Russia alignment. And there is some kind of voices that we should look at China and Russia as, to some extent, one entity, because both China and Russia is a challenge for us, is an even threat. So, as you mentioned, that there is differences between those two countries, I would like to ask you if we should give up the illusion that China is in any major respect different from Russia. Maybe China's playbook is different, but the goals are convergent with Russia, or still there are so many differences between those two countries, and we could, to some extent, count on China and look on China not only as a rival, as a threat, but also to some extent as a partner, as the EU still defines China.
To me, China is more efficient and stronger than Russia. It's also more totalitarian, by the way, or it was. Putin has begun the shift towards totalitarian rule, but even now it's not completed as accurately as it is in China. China doesn't put its eggs in Russia's basket, so to speak. It draws what it can. Let's look at something very curious that has happened recently. Chinese exports to Russia suddenly dropped by 25%, 26% in April, and I've checked, they haven't dropped to Kazakhstan, Mongolia, or Tajikistan. So it's not about COVID and logistics. It's about something that's happening, a downdraft in Russian-China trade after a burst of imports of gas. China will, on the margin, deal with Russia, will evade sanctions on the margin. I have no indication that it would go much further, but China is going to hide and to try and take cover in the hesitations of others. So right now it's playing the so-called Asian way, the Chinese and the Asian way. It's playing the global security initiative. These are all words. I think it matters a lot for Central and Eastern Europe to understand where China is, because in the past, with the 16+1, they might have thought, these Europeans might have thought that they would be able to cut their own deal with China. It hasn't happened either. China plays both sides of the street. That's why I don't believe in a real mediation role by China. A mediator doesn't play both sides of the street. It talks to both sides of the street. And that's something wholly different, which the Chinese don't practice because they are self-centered. So, I don't believe that it's a bloc that would go to the level of a complete alliance. I think there are cracks. I think Putin himself remains cautious on some aspects of the deal, and historically he has been cautious on some aspects of dealing with China. But the goal of, so to speak, detaching China is pure fantasy because China needs Russia as a diplomatic bunker, as a diplomatic bulwark, so to speak, and because ideologically it cannot afford to admit that it's standing alone on these positions.
Thanks, Francois. Is there any question, please?
Thank you. Melissa Conley-Tyler, and sorry you have to listen to my accent a bit more. So thank you, Justina. Thank you, Francois. I wanted to follow up your response on what lessons China is learning for Taiwan. So last year I was based in Taiwan at the Ministry of Defence think tank, and one of the lessons I took from my time there is that in fact it's the economic deterrence that is as or possibly even more important at this stage in China's thinking as the military deterrence. And I'm wondering what lessons you think China's taking from the coordinated economic sanctions, SWIFT system, etc., and what that will be changing about how China will try to adapt. And I suppose I worry a little it might be a tool that can only be used once because China will be now prepared.
Francois, can we have the last question from Minister Onishkevich, and then I will give the floor to you, and we'll we'll finish the panel. Minister.
Well, about 3 years ago, famous Russian actor and director Mikhalkov issued a film as created as kind of a paradocumentary. And the title of the film was China's conquer of Russia. So my question is, taking into account also some sort of comments which I could find in internet in Russia, that two big powers, both sort of revisionist and expansionist power, like Soviet Union and Germany, had an alliance. But how this alliance ended, everybody knows. So what is sort of the possible future, but rather distant future, of relations of Russia and China?
I'll answer that question first, because in France there was also a skit, a comic movie called Les Chinois à Paris, the Chinese in Paris, which was a parody of the German occupation of 1944. And when I went to Beijing and foraged in DVD shops, I found it was very popular actually in Beijing. They looked at it from the other perspective. I'm a Slavophile. I have to say that in Poland, I like Poland, but I did like Russian culture. I do like Russian society and Russian education. I'm terrified by what has happened in the past 20 years and what is happening now. Ultimately, and this, may be a reflection of the French character, and you may criticize our president for having given in too much to that, but I desperately want to give Russian society a chance for the future, and what is, to me, abysmally clear is that China will not give that chance. It has other views. There is no direct connection, no heritage. It's a civilizational gap that exists. So I'm giving you my own prejudice in answer to your question, and I apologize for that. About the question on Taiwan and economic deterrence, well, this is, first of all, justifying, in a way, the direction that Xi Jinping has taken anyway, towards self-reliance, toward indigenous innovations, towards cutting down to size foreign initiative, and cutting down to size some of the so-called private capitalism, or some of the so-called big semi-independent companies. I'm careful about my words because I don't think they were really independent. So it comes more as a justification of the political line. It is not, unfortunately, leading to a policy reversal on the geopolitical front. So yes, it's a worry. And I think, frankly, the only, and I say that I've been critical this morning of a lot of the accent purely on the US, and that some of the apparent disdain of Europe that sometimes appears, but for China, truly the only realistic interlocutor right now is the US, because it's the one that they fear, and Europeans don't inspire fear to China, whether they're Western Europeans or Eastern Europeans, by the way. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Francois. We must finish our short conversation. It was an enormous pleasure. Thank you very much for your very informative and interesting insights. Thank you also for your questions. Thanks.